Welcome to the third in the Center for Economic and Policy Research series on economics you can use. Thanks a lot for coming tonight. This is the third series. I'm going to be following two talks that Dean Baker gave. And my name is John Schmitt, and what I'm going to be talking about tonight are economic inequality and the policies that make it possible. The format is as before. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. And then we'll have 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes of questions and answers. During the first half, unless it's a question of sort of clarification, in order to make sure we can get through this and have plenty of time for discussion afterwards, I'd ask if you kind of hold your questions till then. Tonight, the talk has 3 goals. The first is to familiarize yourself with some trends in inequality and some of the 3 aspects of inequality in the United States that I think are very important. The second goal is to present what I think, or I hope, is a kind of a coherent explanation for why we have inequality, and in particular for the trends in inequality that we've seen over the last 25 years or so. And the third goal is to teach some basic economic self-defense, which is at least one way that we've built these series of talks. So if you don't want to be involved in grabbing me from behind and choking me at a certain point while I show you how to get out of that particular problem, then you might want to scooch back a little bit, stay out of the front rows. So the structure for today's talk, there it goes, is the following. I'm going to talk about what I think are 3 important economic distributions: the wage distribution, the income distribution, and the wealth distribution. And then I want to talk about the political forces shaping those distributions. And the very first point that we want to talk about is what's a distribution, because economists use that term a lot. And it's one of those terms that simply means that economists use for good reasons and for bad reasons. Sometimes economists use things in order to intimidate people and to try and exclude them from a conversation. And that's, I think, a bad reason. But sometimes economists use things because they're a little bit more precise or they convey a particular issue. I think the distribution term is neither here nor there. It's just a helpful term. But by distribution, all I mean is just a formal description of how something is shared or allocated across a population. So it's an important way of getting an idea of how unequal our economy is, and you'll see that in a bit. But before we look at distributions, following off on a point that Dean raised in his very first lecture, I want to put the distributions that we're going to see in a context, because I'm going to show you a lot of trends over the last 25 years or so, and some of them even longer than that. And I want you to understand what the economic inequality we're seeing and the growth that we're seeing, the context in which this is taking place. So I have up here a graph of labor productivity and GDP per capita. And I want to talk about that in a second. But the main point that I'm trying to make with this graph is to show that we are a very much richer country now than we were 25 or 30 years ago. And I think one of the great victories, ideological victories of the right in recent times, is to persuade us somehow that we don't have the resources or the ability to be able to afford the things that we used to be able to afford. We can't afford to do the kinds of education or the kinds of social security system or whatever the particular issue is, that we somehow can't afford to do that. And I think that that's an incredible misrepresentation of the economic circumstances of the United States. We are much, much richer now than we were at the end of the 1970s, which is a break point and a period that I'm going to be talking about a lot. To illustrate that, let me show you these 2 ways of measuring, to a certain degree, how well off we are. The first is labor productivity, which is just the amount in dollars of goods and services that the average worker produces in an hour of work. So essentially that's, the typical worker in the United States in 1979 produced, in this graph, 100, whatever units it is. Say $10 an hour, it doesn't matter. I can tell you exactly what it is, but not off the top of my head. But the average worker in the United States today, in 2004, produces about 65% more stuff after you adjust for inflation than the average worker did back in 1979. That's a huge increase in the amount of output that workers are producing. And it means that we have a lot more that we can be spending and using for whatever purposes we see fit. The other measure I have up here is gross domestic product per capita, which is the national income per person. So you see a very similar kind of a trend. We've had a very big increase on the order of about 2/3. Now, to try and put that into some context, take whatever your salary is now and imagine getting a 60 or 65% increase in your pay increase. You can start to get an idea of the amount of extra stuff that you'd be able to consume or the extra services that you'd be able to purchase. We have a lot more money now, and what I really would like to be doing in the next bit of the talk through the finish of this is to ask, how well are we doing in sharing this increase in what we all as a society produce in the economy with our work. So that's the context, and let's now look at the first distribution, which is the wage distribution. When I talk about wages, this isn't such a foreign concept. I'm just going to be talking about how much people earn per hour. So if you're paid by the hour, it means, I get paid $7 an hour at my job at Cozy up the street. Or if you're paid by an annual salary, what the numbers I'm going to be showing are I get paid $40,000 a year and I work 2,000 hours in the course of a year, so I make about $20 an hour. It's just going to be an hour, a conversion of your annual salary by the amount of hours you work in a year to get the number. And all the numbers I'm going to show you here in terms of wages and in terms of incomes are before taxes. We can talk in the question and answer period about how things would be different in terms of what I'm saying if we looked at the tax question, but I want to put it aside for the moment because it complicates things without changing the core issues of the story I'm telling. So let me start with a snapshot of the current wage distribution. Now, tables are ugly, I'm told. But economists use them a lot, so I think it's important that we maybe look at a few tables in a safe environment where everyone feels comfortable. So I'm going to use a couple of tables to begin with, and then we'll shift to some graphs. So the first table is the distribution, as I said before, a description or of the allocation of wages. Using percentiles. Now, percentiles is usually a pretty easy thing to explain to most people who've taken the SAT scores. You take your SAT and then you see that you came up in the 45th percentile in math and you're never going to get into Brown. Or you got in the 95th percentile and yes, you will make it in. But basically the 50th percentile is the median. It's the person right in the middle. Half of people are below that, half of people are above. The 10th percentile here is a low-wage worker, so that worker makes more than 10% of workers, but less than 90% of workers. And the 90th percentile, think of as a high-wage worker. Someone makes more than 90% of all the workers, but less than 10%. And I just thrown on there the 95th percentile worker, so that's a pretty high-wage worker, and I'll tell you why I've done that in a second. The key issue here is that there are a lot of big gaps. If you look at the gap between the 10th percentile worker and the 50th percentile worker, more or less wages double. They go from about $7 an hour to about $14 an hour. And they double again from the 50th to the 90th percentile, more or less, from 14 to about just over $30 an hour. So there's a big gap, 4 times gap between the 90th and the 10th. And then I've put the 95th percentile on here just to give you an idea of something that happens a lot in the distributions that we're going to look at. That as you get closer to the top, the distances get further and further. So people who are really well off are a lot better off than people who are just well off. And people who are really, really well off are way, way better than that. And we'll see this in a bunch of different kinds of contexts, but I'm just going to alert you to it at this point. Now, that's one way of looking at the gap. So we're just looking at all the workers and we're saying how far are they apart. This is a table that I think caused a gasp when I showed it to somebody once, was telling me this was a terrible way to present material, and I agree. But again, we're feeling safe and comfortable, so let's look at this graph a little bit, this table a little bit more carefully. Now, the reason why economists use tables, as I said, sometimes it's for things, economists do things for good reasons and sometimes for bad reasons. This would be a bad reason in some sense. It's mostly to intimidate, you know, say, look, I know all this stuff and you can't understand it quickly. But the other thing that's beneficial about tables is they actually convey a lot of complex information in a very compact way. So if you're willing to pore over a table that's well constructed, you can actually get a lot of information. Now, I'm not saying this is well constructed, but I think it's not badly constructed, and there is some information here. We can look at this table, for example, for gaps by gender and by race pretty easily. So if you look, and I think this has a pointer. Yeah, I don't know if, you know, you can see how nervous I am because my arm is shaking like this. But the 50th percentile, the middle worker, let's just compare what a woman makes, $12.45, with the 50th percentile male is about $15. So there's a gap of about $3 per hour there. What's interesting when you compare men and women is that as you go up or across the women's line from the 50th to 90th to 95th, and across the men's line from the 50th, 90th, and 95th, the gaps actually get bigger. And when you go the other direction, when you go down to the 10th percentile, the men and women, the gap is actually not that big. And part of what's happening is you're bumping up against the lower bound of what you can pay a person, and they can still pay the rent and eat and things like that. Or you're bumping up against the minimum wage, which you're not quite doing there because the minimum wage now is $5.15 an hour. So we're a little bit above that. But the other thing you can see on this graph is that there's pretty big gaps by race. So if you look in the all part at the top, below that you have all white workers, all black workers, all Hispanic workers. And you can see, you know, fairly large gaps. And as before, the gaps get bigger the further out you go. The 50th percentile black worker makes about $12 an hour. And then the 50th percentile white worker just above makes about $15 an hour, and Hispanics are making a little less than $11 an hour. So there's gaps there, and the gaps get much bigger as we go further along. You know, basically further we go up the distribution. Now, the thing about a table like this is if you wanted to study this, you could look at all sorts of gaps, compare by gender and by race at different levels and things. And it might be the kind of thing that could be useful if you're doing something particular. But the main point I want to say is there's big gaps along race and gender lines. And also don't be intimidated by a graph or a table or whatever just because it looks a little bit complicated at first blush. The main thing, though, I want to say today is not about these snapshots, the graph that, or the table that we just saw here or this table. The real point of what I want to talk about today are the trends over time. And this graph here shows inflation-adjusted wages for the groups 10th, the 50th, and the 90th percentile, so a low wage, a middle wage, and a high wage worker, from the early 70s through the present. And what I've done is I've set all the wages equal to 100 in 1979, and that's in order to be able to show just the growth. I want to talk about how things have changed over time in terms of growth. And this is for all workers in the economy. And what's quite striking is that you can see that the lines before 1979, kind of where they all come together at 100, are actually fairly close together. And if anything, the wages of the 10th percentile, the low wage worker, the thick blue line at the bottom, are actually converging on the wages at the top. They're getting closer, you can see. And then what happens is, starting at the end of the 1970s, we have this explosion in inequality, and you can see the growth at the 10th and the 50th and the 90th spreading apart. That's, I think, one of the main fundamental facts of the economic development of the last 25 or 30 years is captured here in terms of the inequality. And we'll see it again and again in the other distributions that we're going to look at. But some key things to focus on here, that the low-wage worker, the 10th percentile worker, the thick blue line, actually saw significant declines in the purchasing power of their wages over the 1980s. Those declines are huge. They're on the order of about 15% decline in what people were earning. That held flat for much of the 80s, and then you see a big spike up from from the mid-90s through 2000, and then they decline again. If you look at the 50th percentile workers, someone right in the middle, you see that their wages held flat, basically were stagnant for much of the period. This is quite a remarkable thing, even to just have stagnant wage growth. If you look at, we don't have data that's exactly comparable to this, but if we looked at the period from the end of World War II to about 1979, wages were probably growing about 2% a year, maybe even 3% a year over that period. So for us to find our wages not growing at all after you adjust for inflation is a really remarkable fact. And then you see what's happening to a 90th percentile worker, a relatively high wage worker. Well, at first blush, it looks like they're getting, making some progress. They're up 30% or so at the peak period there. But remember that first graph I showed you in terms of context. The GDP per capita and productivity growth are up 60, 65%. And this is a very high wage worker, and they're not even managing to keep pace with the average increase in productivity for all workers. So this is quite a remarkable lowering of the ability of the economy to translate economic growth into decent wages for people. Now, that's an overview of the basic situation. I want to call your attention to one thing, which is this pretty good spell that you see here and here and here at the end of the 1990s, from about 95, 96 to about 2000. That was a period of sustained low unemployment, and that's going to become important when we talk about the political economy of some of this stuff a little bit later. But just keep that in the back of your mind as we go along. Now, that's the overall picture. Just to be very clear, the position, if you look at the distribution for men and for women, is very different. You have a clarification question?
Yes, I'll make it brief. Am I looking at, for any given data point here, am I looking at the hourly wages for that percentile for that year, or the growth?
Just the change relative to 1979. The question is this the actual wage that people are earning, or is it something else? And it's something else. It's the change relative to setting it all equal to 100. So in the 10th percentile, say, was $5 per hour in 1979. That was set equal to 100. But the 90th percentile might have been $25 per hour. That was also set equal to 100. So everything starts out as 100. It's not like we were all making the same amount of money in 79. We're just spreading out. We're looking at how much has growth or changed over time. Okay.
So it was $5 an hour in 1979 for the low wage worker, and it's still $5
basically
in 2003.
Yeah. We'll look at basically we're at the same point for a low wage worker now as we were 25 years ago, and that's after this good stretch from 96 to 2000. Now, the situation for men and women is very different, and I'll cover this very quickly, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that the overall picture is the picture, describes well the picture for men and for women separately. This is a picture for men, which actually looks a lot like the overall picture with one difference. Middle wage men, that's the red dashed line, actually saw significant declines after you adjust for inflation, along with the lower wage men. And the higher wage men saw some increases, but again, that's maybe 20% at the end of the period relative to 60% increase or more than 60% increase in productivity. The picture for women is a little bit different, and it's interesting. All of these are on the same scale, so they all go up to about 150. So you can compare these across. Whoop, come on. So that and that are on the same scale. This is the women's picture. What you see here is for the 10th percentile women, you see a decline in the real value of their earnings, and then flattens, and then it rises a lot, not quite up to where they were back in 1979. The middle wage woman in the 50th percentile sees pretty strong, steady increases, modest increases, I mean 20, 25%. And then 90th percentile women see very large increases after you adjust for inflation, on the order of 50%. Now again, these are still less than what we saw as average productivity growth, but relative to everybody else, they're doing quite well. A couple of features here that are worth looking at. The women's distribution is a lot more unequal at the end of the period than it was at the beginning of the period. That's one thing to notice. And in terms of what I hope you don't think is a rosy picture that I'm portraying of the situation that women face, the couple of things to keep in mind are that women at every point in the distribution, we already saw, are still making a lot less than men are. We saw that in that first graph, second table. And the second thing is that the women who are working in the labor force in 2004 are a lot better educated, have a lot more work experience, and are about 5 years on average older than the women who were working back in 1979. So we would have expected some significant increases in wages no matter what, and we're seeing them to a certain degree. So I'll just leave it at that. The situation for women at the bottom is tough. For men at the bottom, it's tough, and for men at the middle, it's tough. And for people above that, things are a little bit better than they were back in 1979, but we kind of would have expected that given the big increases in productivity and the improvements that we've had in the workforce itself. To summarize the wage information, we've had very unequal growth. We have a lot of inequality in wages, and we've had a very unequal growth in wages over the period since the end of the 1970s. But now I want to show you some trends, not from wages, but from income. So wages is what you make per hour. Income is what you make in a year, but not just from work. We also include things like what you get in Social Security payments or what you get from stock income. If you own a house and you rent out part of it, the rent that you receive. If you have a small business, the profits you get from the small business. So this is a much more complete description of income, and it's over a full year. And as I said before, the income numbers that we're going to look at here are before taxes. So we could talk about taxes afterwards, but the numbers here ignore tax cuts or any other things. Now, here's another table. And what I want to do here is a similar sort of thing. Start with a snapshot of where we are in roughly the 2000s, and then look at some trends afterwards. So this is a snapshot actually for 2001, and that's just because the way these things get reported in 2004, they didn't report it in quite the same way. And I think this captures exactly the way I want to present it, and the differences between 2001 and 2004 for the purposes of what I'm talking about are trivial. What this shows is the distribution of income. For where it says lowest fifth, that's the 20th percentile. The second fifth is the 40th percentile. The middle fifth is the 60th percentile. The fourth fifth is the 80th percentile. And then the lower limit of the top 5% is the 95th percentile. So if we want to think about it in terms that we were thinking about before. Again, if you look at the line for all, there are big gaps across these distributions. For example, the 20th percentile is making about $24,000. If you go to the 80th percentile, it's about $94,000. It's not quite a 4 times increase, but it's close to it. Now, if you stop and remember, the 90th to the 10th percentile in the wage distribution was about 4 times increase. So here we're looking at a change from the 20th to the 80th percentile, and we're seeing almost as big an increase. And that's because the income distribution is even more unequal in the wage distribution. And it makes sense because you work, and that's one source of your income, and that's a kind of inequality. But then you have all these people who don't work but get income, and a lot of them get a lot of money. Or they don't work and they don't get much income, and they're at the bottom, so it stretches things out even more. The other big gap here, if you look, is the 95th percentile is at $164,000, which, again, is a lot more than the 80th percentile. It's not quite double, but it's a lot more. So you start to see how things are spread out. The other thing you can see here is that there are quite big gaps by race. And that's true across the board. If you look at the 20th percentile white family, they make about $26,000. The 20th percentile black family, it's about $14,000. Hispanics is about $16,000. And you can see those inequalities, those big gaps across the board at every level, to the point where even a very well-to-do black family is making, on the order of $60,000 less per year than a well-to-do white family. But again, I'm mostly interested not so much in the snapshot from right now, but in how these things have changed over time. And I think for me, the next two graphs that I'm going to show you are probably the most important things that I want to talk about today. This shows the median family income adjusted for inflation from 1947 to 2003. The median family income is the 50th percentile. This is the family right in the middle, so it's the typical family in the country. And what the blue line, the dark blue line shows is how that's changed over time. And one thing you can see is that between the end of World War II, 1947, and the mid-1970s, real income for the median family more or less doubled. Okay, in a relatively short period of time, their income doubled. And it was growing rapidly, and it increased to about there. Then what you see is this flattening with some increase, but it's definitely growing a lot slower than it had been before. The dotted line there is just a projection of what wages, or what family incomes would have looked like if they'd continued to grow at the pace they had from that first post-war period. And you can see we've fallen far below the pace of growth that we had up until that point. And in fact, the gap here between what we would have seen if we'd continued and where we actually were is about $20,000 a year. So these are not small amounts of money if you consider that the median family might be at, say, $50,000, something like that, or $45,000, $50,000. Politically, this is really important because I think it starts to say a little bit about the world that we've lived in and the expectations that we had. We came from a period where rapid growth was happening for middle-income families, and then we entered a period in the 1970s when suddenly growth was a lot harder to come by. If you consider that a lot of the growth that was happening here, I was trying to shoot the laser and, come on.
You have to point it at the
Okay. Thank you. Technical advice there. A lot of the growth that actually did take place here was because, in particular, women in families were working a lot more hours. They're entering the labor force where they hadn't worked before, and they were working more hours when they did work. So in some ways, people were working harder and harder just to stay in the same place. Now, that is an important backdrop for this graph, which looks terrible up there, but I should like to shift it up a little bit. But I think this is the most important graph, and most important thing I'm going to talk about today. This shows the annual growth rate in inflation-adjusted family incomes over two periods, 1947 to 1973, and then 1973 to 2003, but broken down by 5 different income categories. So the 20th percentile, the 40th percentile, the 60th, 80th, and 95th percentile. And there's two things that really, I think, jump out here. The first is that the blue graphs, the blue bars, which are for the first post-war period, are a lot higher than the red bars for the more recent period. So growth has been much slower between 1973 and the present than it was before then. And the second thing that really jumps out is that growth is a lot more unequal than it used to be. If you look at the earlier period, almost all the bars are roughly the same height. And in fact, the 60th and 80th are a little bit higher than the top, the 95th, and the 40th is even equal there. The 20th is falling off a little bit, but relative to the situation we see in the most recent period, where we have very small growth at the 20th, 40th, 60th, and then 0.9% or 1.3% is slow growth, but it's a lot higher than the growth that's taking place at the bottom of the economy. So we're growing more slowly, and we're growing much more unequally, the same kind of trends that we saw in terms of the wage distribution. I think politically, this is extremely important for two reasons. One, I think this is the kind of thing that contributes to the feeling of scarcity amid the abundance that we actually really have. And that, I think, drives a lot of the kind of politics of despair that I think led to, for example, people, working class people turning to Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s as someone that could save them from these kinds of problems that they were starting to face, which in fact I think he actually exacerbated them with the politics and policies that he followed. The other thing is that's important politically, and this is a point I think that Dean was making in a slightly different context last week. So back when we were doing everything wrong, okay, when we had a high minimum wage and we had important unions that really were a political force and an economic force, back when we had lots of regulation of the economy, we had much faster growth and it was much more equal than what we have right now. At the very least, all you can certainly conclude from this that doing things the way we used to do them is not incompatible with strong and equal growth. And I think you could say a lot more than that. I think you could argue that some of the things we used to do actually made this happen, but it's certainly not inconsistent with that. Now let me pass, but as I said, I think this graph and this graph for me are probably the most important things I'm going to talk about. But I want to now show you a bunch of statistics about the final distribution, which is the wealth distribution, net wealth. Wealth is a slightly different concept than what we've just been talking about. You basically, to determine someone's net wealth, you take all of their assets, the value of their house, their car, their checking account, their savings account, and you subtract away from it all of their debts. So you subtract their mortgage on their house, you subtract the car loan, you subtract their student loans, you subtract their credit card debts and other debts and liabilities that they might have. And you come up with a number which is their net worth or their net wealth. And this distribution, I think amazingly, but you might think differently, is way more unequal than the wage and income distributions. And that's the main reason to show you it, to finish. It's a bit of just sort of gluttony of how could it be so bad, but it is pretty bad. So this figure shows the share of wealth in the top 1% and the bottom 80% of the distribution of the United States. In 1962, the year of my birth, that's only a coincidence that they did the survey then. But I always liked that I know exactly the way the world looked the year I was born. And then 1983, 1989, and 2001. Unfortunately, the data for 2004 will be released in January, is my understanding. So we can't look at them and see how the last few years have played out. But this is the most recent data that are available for the moment. Well, this is shocking what's happening here. The distribution is incredibly concentrated. In 1962 and into 2001, the top 1% of the wealth distribution controlled 33.4% of the total wealth in the economy. And you can see that there was a big shift. Wrong way. Sorry. There's a big shift between 83 and 89, which just happens to be years I did this survey when Ronald Reagan was president. Big shift in the upwards in the share that was controlled by the top 1%. It dipped again. My understanding from people who study this is it's mostly because the value of the stock held by these people tanked in 2000 and 2001, and they sort of were hit hard by that. But contrast that with what the bottom 80% owns in the economy. You have 19%, 18.7, falling to 16.5, and now 15.6. So the rest of the country, 80% of the country, the vast majority of people, has a tiny fraction, a small fraction of the overall earnings, overall wealth, and it's actually falling over the period. So just to put some quick numbers on this, another nasty table, but this is the key number. The top 1%, the value, the number, the average amount that they hold in wealth is about $13 million. And if you zip down here to the middle, it's about $75,000. For that $75,000 is almost certainly the value of somebody's house minus the mortgage that they still have to pay on it. For most people, wealth is the house. For people up here, it's stock and the value of the companies that they own privately sometimes. But there's obviously a much larger spread between the top and the bottom here than there are in the wage or income distribution. And I'm going to, in effort of, I only have a few minutes left, I'm going to, no, page down. Yeah, I'll just zip through this. One important thing to keep in mind when we talk about the wealth distribution is that there's a lot of people that have no wealth at all or have negative wealth, or they have tiny amounts of wealth, $10,000 or less. I mean, something that you could hardly live off of in your retirement. And the share of people in that situation is quite large. So, for example, you have in 2001, about 30% of the American households have less than $10,000 worth of wealth. The total value of everything that they own minus what they owe is less than $10,000. And of that group, about 18% actually have no wealth whatsoever or are net debtors. So these are, substantial portions of the population that are in very difficult circumstances financially. This is one of the many reasons why Social Security is so important, because most of these people, that's all that they'll have in terms of income. This is a little bit of a graph that shows some of the trends in wealth and why the wealth distribution is so stagnant over time. Well, why it's so concentrated over a long period of time. We just summed up the share of wealth, how much wealth increased over this period, and said, where did the wealth go to? What you could see is about a third of the increase in wealth between 1983 and 2001 went to the top 1%. The next third of the increase in wealth of that period went to the next 4%. And to skip to the bottom, over that period, the remaining 60%, the bottom 60% of the population got about 1.4% of all of the increase in wealth over this period. So it's highly concentrated, and it's staying that way over long periods of time. Now, the question that I want to now look at briefly is the political economy of redistribution. And I know probably most of you think of redistribution in the sense of let's take from the rich and give to the poor. But this is the political economy of redistribution upward, because that's fundamentally what we've seen. We've had this big increase in productivity, big increase in income, but the people at the bottom are often getting less, and the people at the top are getting much, much more. What I would like to talk about is essentially, how did what we just saw happen? What happened? What made it possible? And what my simple, maybe somewhat argue simplistic explanation is that we've had a diverse set of policies that I think have one common thread. If you look at these policies, and we'll talk a little bit in detail about some of them, they have a common thread, and it's very clear that they all decrease the bargaining power of workers relative to their employers. They might do other things. They might be argued. People might argue in favor of them for other reasons, but the key issue is that's what they do, and it's not at all surprising that we've seen the trends we see given the policies that we have. So let's look at these in turn. Let's look first at the fact that we've had a big decline in the purchasing power and the minimum wage. So if you adjust for inflation, changes in prices, the minimum wage has gone down a lot. The minimum wage today in $2,000, in 2004 is about here, which is about where it was at the end of the 1950s. Now, that I think should be a cause of national embarrassment that we can't pay low-wage workers now any more than we could pay them before I was born. That's pretty embarrassing. The other thing to think about is that in the 1980s, we had a big decline in the value of the minimum wage because basically Ronald Reagan refused to increase the minimum wage over that period. So each year, inflation erodes its value. And we see it falling. Now, if you remember those graphs for the wages, particularly for women and men at the 10th percentile, this is exactly the period when they're all falling. So you can see that basically we've pulled the bottom out of the wage market, the labor market, by getting rid of the minimum wage, and it actually has real effects, and things happen to people. I think the clearest way to think about the minimum wage from a social perspective is that the minimum wage is really a way that it's about bargaining power for low-wage workers. It's the way we as a society stand behind a low-wage worker who's facing McDonald's or Burger King and say, you have to pay this person the amount of money that we say, which is now $5.15 an hour. And I think we need to see it as a bargaining power issue for low-wage workers because I think that's the way it works, and you can see the impact there. A second policy that we've changed that we've seen that's important is the decline in unionization. And you can see that here, and it accelerates a lot in the 1980s. It's flattening now a little bit, but it's continuing down quite a bit. And this is the public and private sector together. In the private sector, it's actually much lower. I want to emphasize that this is a policy outcome. This is not, part of it is we've had a decline in manufacturing where unions are strong. And part of it is a failure of the labor movement to sort of get with it at certain points in its history, recent history. But I think it's primarily a result of government and corporate policies that are very, very clear and have been well studied by a lot of academic economists and others. You have Ronald Reagan and the PATCO strike when he comes into power in the early 1980s and fires all the air traffic controllers, replaces them. And I think that set a signal across a lot of the corporate world and within the government that said shifted the balance of power strongly. We changed the nature of the National Labor Relations Board, which became much more hostile to unions over the period of the 1980s and since. We've seen a rise in union-busting consultants, which often employ tactics which are outside even the laws that we have in this country, and do it quite successfully and end up paying the fines or the price or whatever the short-term penalties they have in exchange for long-term reductions in unionization rates. We also have the worst legal system by far in all of the advanced capitalist economies in terms of the way unions are dealt with in the legal code. And we've also seen over this period quite explicit threats from globalization that have been fairly coordinated, where firms will say, we're going to move if you do any union organizing. So all of these things together I think really are a policy outcome. And it's clear that unions do a lot of different things politically and economically. I think I have 5 more minutes. Is that right? But the one thing that we know they do incredibly well is narrow the wage distribution, essentially by representing strong bargaining power for middle wage and upper wage workers, and in some cases increasingly lower wage workers in the new service economy. Let me go back and show you. The third issue that I want to talk about is economic deregulation. Again, this is another bargaining power issue for workers. We had unions, we had workers in industries like trucking, airlines, telecommunications, banking, a lot of other sectors in the economy in the 1980s that were deregulated. And that deregulation, again, it might have been argued for a lot of different reasons, but the fact that these industries were regulated, often meant that they represented ways of protecting the workers from direct competition in ways that may have had efficiency implications, but they certainly had implications for the wages of workers in those sectors. So by deregulating the economy, we actually reduced the bargaining power for these workers. A closely related concept is a privatization that we've seen over the last 20 or 25 years. And in the United States, because we don't have large nationally owned steel companies, that typically takes the form of deregulation of state and local enterprises. Things like school cafeterias get contracted out, or school bus drivers, or administrative functions at local welfare offices get privatized. So we've seen a lot of things, or private prisons and a whole bunch of things like that. These are direct bargaining power issues, because if you're working in the public sector, workers tend to have a lot more bargaining power than they do face-to-face with private sector employers, especially when they're not union. So again, this may or may not have efficiency benefits for the economy, but we know it has huge impacts on the workers in those sectors. And they bleed over because workers who lose their job or have to take worse conditions lower the bar for everybody in the economy. Another development we have is welfare reform, which it's obvious if you reduce women's ability to have an outside option in their bargain, and they can't just say, I'm not going to work for that wage, I'm going to continue to take the offer I have from the government in terms of welfare. Their bargaining power has declined a lot. And it also decreases the bargaining power for women and men who are directly competing with the influx of welfare reformed workers. Welfare clearly needed to be reformed, but not necessarily in the way that we did it, and certainly not in the way that we did it. And one of the impacts of it was to decrease the bargaining power of workers. Pro-corporate globalization is another issue. We've had globalization for a long, long, long time, but I think what's particularly been a problem over the last 20 or 25 years is that it's taken a completely pro-corporate kind of approach. And what it fundamentally is about is putting U.S. workers in competition with low-wage foreign workers. There might be efficiency gains, but I would argue that those efficiency gains are small relative to the distributional impact. So what happens is steel workers or auto workers or textile workers are put in direct competition with workers in countries that pay substantially less than is paid here. That might make for cheaper cars, but it certainly makes for lower wages for workers in those industries. We also have immigration, which has an entire moral dimension, which I think is extremely important. But if we look, and it's certainly possible to exaggerate the effects of immigration on wages, but we're putting low-wage workers who were born in the United States in more direct competition with low-wage workers who were born elsewhere and have fewer rights and lower expectations about what is considered to be a living wage. And it has important impacts on the distribution. And the other issue is that pro-corporate globalization is so clearly not about free trade, as my colleagues Dean and Mark are often making the point, because there's a lot of protectionist elements in these things that are there fundamentally to protect the incomes and wages of workers at the top or more likely their employers. I'm skipping quickly because I don't have a lot of time, but let me just make the last point, which is recessionary macroeconomic policy. From basically the end of the 1970s, and even a little before, through the mid-1990s, we had very high unemployment rates in this country relative to what they could have been. And that was because of monetary policy, keeping interest rates very high at the end of the 70s and the 80s, and to a certain degree because of fiscal policy as well, which became a little bit more restrictive a little bit later after the Republicans got out of office, and whatever. In any event, it's really important to think about what the impact of high unemployment is. It completely undermines the bargaining power of workers. If you have low, sustained unemployment for a long time, workers are in a position to be picky and choose where they work and how much they work for and ask for more without facing the fear of losing their job, or if they lose their job, they can then walk across the street and get a job that pays better somewhere else. When unemployment is high, it really robs workers of their power to bargain effectively. If you recall, just to kind of illustrate this point, the best stretch that we've had in a really long time in the economy was from the end of about 96 to about 2000, when the unemployment rate was a sustained low level of unemployment, much lower than economists said it could go to. It was at 5%, and then it was at 4%, and it stayed and it stayed and it stayed, and we didn't have inflation, but what we did have was big increases in workers' wages. And that's just a fundamentally important point. And I hope that it helps to illustrate the actual strength of increasing workers' bargaining power in helping all of these distributions, the wage distribution and the income distribution, and to a certain degree, in the very long haul, even the wealth distribution. Well, I'm sorry to run over a little bit. Thank you very much for your patience and your attention.